The more complicated it is, I feel like the more complicated.
Why don't you try this joke sometime?
I finished the test.
I got on it like 3 times a week. I'm like looking at it, I'm watching videos, I'm like.
It's okay. I'm so burned.
You're so what?
I'm so burned.
What did you do?
I just got my back and I didn't do my exercise at all. This is me and Mirina. Yeah. Put Marina's name on it as well?
Yeah, she gets her 0, sorry.
As long as you know we're partners.
Yeah, I got it.
Oh my god.
Alright, so today, what I wanted to do, I can move some of these books down. Oh, I got a free cell phone?
Oh, can I have it?
Cool, no, it's mine. Mine now. Okay, so I wanted to prepare a lesson that's just kind of a random side topic, no bearing on the content of this class, but just because I think it's neat. And so we're going to take a look at Euclidean and then non-Euclidean geometry. So we're going to dive into like what that's all about. Yeah. You can if you want to, because there's fun facts. But nothing. There will be no homework. There will be no test. It's just learning because we can learn. Yeah.
Who's your favorite mathematician?
My favorite mathematician, Euclid.
Okay. It's not
Because he's like the most or the original math teacher. Euclid is like he didn't actually. There's something about him. Like he didn't. I'm sure he came up with some original stuff, but none of this is actually his original thought. He's just the guy that took all these random things people had done and put it all into a logical format. So it's not that any of these theorems are his theorems or these ideas are necessarily his ideas, but his idea was to take everything that's been floating around and to put it all into one nice, cohesive format. So, you know, he's kind of started my job, so, yeah. All right.
OG Joyce.
So this was about, 2,300 years ago or so? So, a ways back. Oh, is this?
Oldie.
I'm gonna leave the. I don't know what that's about. I'm gonna leave some suspense going right now. I'm gonna go get new batteries.
Ooh, some suspense.
Yeah. Not gonna throw those away?
I'm gonna recycle them.
Okay. Into the ocean.
That's gonna wait till
So way bad in there. How do you do that? I don't know.
Oh.
That just makes you not travel at all.
Yeah.
So how do you go backwards? You go faster.
Are you mouthing something? No. Okay.
Josh, read my lips.
Josh, turn around. No, the balls, mate. Balls. Oh, this?
Time goes back.
You all can see it here at home.
I feel like I just
Okay, so here we go. Let's go take a look at this. So first, just a little bit of background on the guy Euclid. Thank you. So, but this is what he's really known for, is creating what's called the Elements. And it's like the first math book. Like he made the first geometry textbook. And what's kind of amazing is up until like the start of the 1900s, aside from like obviously translating it to English and maybe tweaking some of the wording, geometry books were essentially what he created here. There were little adjustments here and there and some of the finer details, but like that's pretty much what it was. And now like you have, you know, teaching methods where you're trying to like do investigative learning and stuff. But like the main concept of how geometry is taught is what he was doing here when he created this about 2,300 years ago. The way he formatted it, the idea is you create some definitions. So it's like, okay, let's make sure we have some common vocabulary. We create these postulates, which we also sometimes call axioms, which is like, we have to start with something. What are things that we just like say, okay, we can all agree that this is a true statement. We're just going to say it, and we all agree with it, and we move from there, because you've got to start somewhere. And then from those, you start creating your theorems. And with your theorems, you can build off of those definitions and those postulates and make more theorems and more theorems and more theorems. And from that, you get all of geometry. So we've got our, well, undefined terms. That's just like me talking to you right now. Like it's just understood, like we understand the language that we're using. Right? We have words and we just inherently know what they mean. We have some words that aren't quite as obvious, and so we define those using the undefined terms, the axioms or the postulates, things that are just true, and the theorems, sometimes called propositions, things that we can prove using those axioms and definitions. Okay, so when we get into Euclid's Elements, one of the key things, and like just sort of the idea behind constructing geometry is, okay, we're going to create these axioms, but it's better to have less of them, right? The goal was to create all of geometry with the fewest axioms, the fewest things that are assumed to be true, because it's better to prove something to be true rather than to just make the assumption that it's true. And over and over and over again, mathematicians tried to get this down as small as they could get it to be, and eventually it got to the point where it was 5. There are 5 axioms needed to create all of math, or all of geometry anyway.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
All of geometry.
All of geometry can be built up from these 5 statements.
Are you going to show us the project?
No. No. These 5 statements are critical to the entire idea of Euclidean versus non-Euclidean geometry. So we'll see. So we've got some definitions. Euclid's definitions often don't make much sense the way that they're written in Greek 2,300 years ago. So we define things differently nowadays. But if you were to translate Euclid's definition of a point, it's that which has no part. Seems a little bit, I don't know, it's yeah, a little vague. But that which has no part, which makes sense. Like that's what a point is, right? A point is just like a thing that has no dimension. So that which has no part. A line, a breadthless length. Straight lines, a line which lies evenly within the points on itself. That makes lots of sense. So it's a little bit oddly worded, but you can get past that. Then parallel lines. It's important to understand how parallel lines are defined for the sake of of creating geometry. So they're not defined as being. Actually, I should have. How many of you have not yet read that? How would you define parallel lines? If you just had to tell somebody what a parallel line is.
But they're in the same plane.
In 2 dimensions.
We'll assume we're in plane geometry. Yeah.
Can lines be parallel?
Can what? Yes. Because a line isn't.
I think a parallel line has to be.
When we talk about straight lines, a line which lies evenly with the points on itself.
What if you have?
We're used to straight lines being what we think of as like straight. But if your plane isn't straight, then your straight lines aren't going to be just like continuously going in the same direction. They're going to potentially curve and take a different path. So it's a little bit strange. That's what caused a lot of confusion early on. Is when we talk about lines, we're used to thinking of a line just being like, oh, it's a line, it's straight, but that's not as straightforward as it seems.
I was just saying, yeah, like, I mean, I don't know, parabola, isn't that still just going with all the points on itself?
Yes.
Maybe not even.
Oh, Mr. Joyce realized the problem with that.
Huh?
You realized the problem with the axiom.
Did we just disprove 2300 years worth of work?
So non-Euclidian was based on the fifth proofing wrong.
what
What
is
about
it?
the third proofing wrong?
What is parallel line? Does it say straight line or?
So parallel lines are lines which, being in the same plane and being produced in definitely both directions, do not meet in either direction. Parallel lines don't cross.
So do two sine curves set apart from each other? Going off in this other.
If we defined a line to be a sine curve, but
right, because like
yeah,
they never touch. But
yeah, I'm trying to work through in planar geometry.
because if its parallel lines are straight lines, then that solves it. But
Yeah, but doesn't a sine curve go up and down as well as just a line would just be flat
no, what?
on like
This actually was so.
D, dog.
To be quite honest, when I was tweaking this earlier, this originally did say straight lines
I would think because
parallel lines are straight lines.
Yeah.
I took that out because I thought it'd make it simpler, but I think you're right. It changes the meaning.
Yeah.
No, my point is,
But-
you can't put two sine
Mr.
curves
Joyce
on
tried
the
to
same
outline
plane and make them
loss.
parallel.
Why?
They have to be flat.
What?
That's not what
You absolutely can.
This is flat. So
Sine
these are two
and
sine
sine
curves.
plus 1.
Yeah.
Then they understand.
Sine plus like.
Sine plus a little bit more.
Okay. So a straight line. Here we go. Here I've got it kind of worked out. So a straight line is a line which lies evenly within the points on itself. Meaning, on whatever surface you're on, it's the collection of. If you took 2 points, a straight line is going to be the collection of points that are directly between those points. If you took the direct path from one point to another point, that's what a straight line is. Now, think if your surface was not a plane. Think it was like a ball. Like think of like you watch flight routes, and like if I'm going from here to Europe, typically they take you over like Iceland, right? It doesn't take you can't just look at the map projection here and go, oh, I'm just going to go straight over to there. You actually take a different route, which when projected on a two-dimensional plane, a flat plane, looks like an arc. But in reality, that arc was a straight line on that spherical surface. Does that make more sense? So when we say it's a straight line, if I'm going from this point to this point, I need all the points that are directly in between them in the shortest route possible.
It's like the relativity thing, right? We talk about it in physics, and how like the light bends when it is going straight.
Yeah.
Just looks-
Exactly. Okay, so what we need to get out of this definition of parallel, though, because that's really the most important one for us, is parallel lines do not meet. There's nothing in this definition of parallel that says they're equidistant from each other. That is not part of the definition of parallel lines. It's a consequence of parallel lines in planar geometry that if they're parallel, if they don't meet, they end up being equidistant everywhere. But that's not part of how they're defined.
Equidistant meaning that one part of the line.
If you go directly from one to the other, it's always the same distance.
Okay.
So if we're in planar geometry, you're going 90 degrees from one to the other, and that distance would always be the same in planar geometry.
Wait, so is planar non-Euclidic or Euclidic?
Planar is, when we say Euclidean geometry, we're talking planar geometry. That's the geometry that you learned in Mr. Lander's class, or I guess you probably took it in middle school. So whoever taught it, that's the geometry that we learned. We learned Euclidean geometry.
I loved how. People have loved her.
Okay, so now that we've got some things defined, especially understanding that parallel just means they do not meet, not that they're equidistant, to build on that, it's like the idea of we define an equilateral triangle as having 3 sides of the same length, right? That's how it's defined. It turns out that an equilateral triangle has 3 60-degree angles. That's something that comes as a consequence of that. Right? That would have to be proved as a theorem based on what we already know. Okay, anyway, now we have our 5 postulates. So now that we know just what some things are, we have some facts we need to just say, we're going to agree that this is true. And the wording's a little bit strange. It says to draw a straight line from any point to any point, meaning it is possible to draw that line. So if I have a point here and I have a point here, it's important to understand that a lot of the geometry comes from constructions. Did you all do compass and straight edge
Yes.
constructions? So that's a big part of how geometry is created. The idea is if you have something that you can put down a point and create the arc of a circle, and if you have something with a straight edge, are there things that we can create? Well, if I have 2 points, I can connect them with a ruler and I can draw that line from one to the other. That's what this is saying here. Which seems like it's hard to disagree with that, right? I've got 2 points, I can draw a line. Yeah, I can do that. To produce a finite straight line continuously in a straight line. So if you have a segment, you could keep on extending it. There's no end potentially to that line. You can always make a line longer. You can keep on going in both directions. To describe a circle with any center and distance, meaning I can choose a point, and using my construction methods, I can just sweep out a circle of any radius that I choose. All right angles are equal to one another. If I've got a right angle here and I've got another right angle here, they have the same angle measure. What's that? Flip it around.
Oh.
Okay. And then we get to number 5, and I'll just let you read number 5.
Parallel postulate.
I gotta read it again. Yeah.
One of these is not like the other, right?
Oh, okay.
Easy peasy.
So if a straight line falling on 2 straight lines make the interior angles less than 2 right angles, so let's draw.
Triangle. They make triangle.
So I've got a line here, I've got another line here, and if I cross another line over these, if these 2 angles are less than 90 degrees, they don't have to be the same, so they could be different measures, but if they're less than 90 degrees, the 2 straight lines, if produced indefinitely, you see those dotted lines?
Triangle.
If I keep on going, eventually, if produced enough meet on the side on which are the angles less than 2 right angles. So if I keep this going, and those are less than 90 degrees, eventually, those are going to cross each other. And like I said, form a triangle. So the parallel postulate, that's what we call this one. Number 5 is the parallel postulate, which says exactly this right here. And obviously, much more confusingly worded than the others. Yeah.
Why it's called parallel postulate if it's just saying how to not parallel?
Yeah, there's no parallel lines anywhere.
If a line falling on 2 straight lines. Should we call it the not parallel postulate?
Yeah.
Okay, the not parallel postulate.
Why is it? What?
Because it has to do with parallelism. That's a word. That's a word. That's a word.
Is this where it comes in that you can have 3 right triangles and it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
Euclidean? Okay.
So the point being, on a plane, this is a true statement. On a plane, this is a true statement. This is what you've used every time you've done any sort of geometry problem. But this didn't sit well with mathematicians pretty early on. It just didn't seem right. And I don't know what I have on the rest of these slides, so I'll just talk about it, and then maybe it'll repeat itself. But basically, there was the initial thought was, okay, this seems way too complicated. This has got to be able to be proved from the other 4. So the initial idea was, let's take these other 4 postulates, and let's see if we can assemble them in some way to create a proof that shows that number 5 is true. Now that thing's no longer a postulate, we can just make it a theorem, and that would be better. Because it's okay, theorems are often really confusingly worded, but they're proved to be true. And so for hundreds and more likely thousands of years, people tried to prove this, and there were tons and tons of people that came up with a proof and they thought that they got it. They're like, this is it, I finally found a way to prove this. And then upon looking at it, it was always figured out that somewhere along the way, they used the parallel postulate without quite realizing it. They did some sort of circular reasoning or something like that. And then eventually it was able to be proved that this cannot be proved from the other 4. So it was a proof that the proof does not exist. I said, with these 4, I can prove that it's impossible to make this statement here, therefore this statement is required. Yes. What's that?
Is that theorem?
No. That's what he just
Well,
explained.
no, not this, but the proof.
Yeah. The theorem that says that cannot be proved.
Yeah, that would be a theorem.
That's what
Which then makes this a postulate.
Get out of here, bitch.
Okay. Let's see. What do I have next here? This is what I just said. Okay, now one thing that we can at least do, Euclid, for as much as he did for us, it was all great. That the way he wrote the postulate, maybe not the best. And so another thing that mathematicians did after it was determined, okay, we can't prove this thing, or more likely even while they were trying to prove that, they're like, we need a better way of saying this. And so it turns out there are a number of statements that are logically equivalent to the parallel postulate, so you can basically use it in place of it. And it would often be something that shows up as a proof. If you start with that parallel postulate we just had, you could prove another statement. Well, that statement in turn could be like swapped out for the parallel postulate and used in its place. So if one's true, then the other one has to be true and vice versa. So instead of the parallel postulate, maybe we have something like this. This is called Playfair's axiom, which is the more commonly used statement. So it turns out to be logically equivalent to the statement that we just had. And it's a little bit nicer. It's not quite so weird. Okay. So at most, one line can be drawn parallel to another point through a given external point. What that means is if I draw a line, and if I have a point, I can only draw one line through that point, which is parallel to the other line. There does not exist another line through that point parallel. This one is going to have to intersect eventually. There's only one line that goes through that point.
Well, that makes sense why it's called parallel postulate. The lines are parallel.
Okay. So logically equivalent, but just worded, kind of presented in a different way. Other statements that are logically equivalent. You add up the angles of a triangle and you always get the same amount. We know that amount to be 180. Every triangle turns out to add up to 180. That turns out to be a logically equivalent statement.
Was this named the parallel postulate? Was that assigned to it after, like, years after?
It's just kind of the name it's known as. I don't know when that became sort of the way we refer to it. Yeah, I'm not sure. You can also talk about it in terms of quadrilaterals. Basically, this says there exists a rectangle. A rectangle existing turns out to be equivalent to the parallel postulate. If two lines are parallel to the same line, they're parallel to each other, also logically equivalent. It might not be completely apparent right off the bat why these are logically equivalent, but it can be shown that they are. If one's true, then the other one necessarily is, so they can be swapped out for each other.
Some people did those proofs.
Yeah, they went through the proof and said, oh, look at this, this is actually the same thing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so Euclidean geometry, we assume that the parallel postulate is true, that there is basically any one of those statements there. Essentially, that if two lines are parallel, they're going to stay equidistant, or there's only one parallel line through another point. However you want to think about it, basically stuff dealing with parallel lines works the way we think it should. That's Euclidean geometry. And Euclidean geometry is viewed on a flat plane. That's why we can just use like a piece of paper and you can draw your lines, you can make your triangles and do all that sort of stuff, and that's where it works. If we start with just the first four postulates, this is often referred to as neutral geometry, which is just like, okay, let's get some things out of the way here. Let's ignore the parallel postulate for now. What's everything that we can do without it? So what's the stuff that's true no matter what? And then we get to the parallel postulate, and that's where we start kind of going some different directions. So if we don't use the parallel postulate, we go through and we try to just prove some things that we can prove, some statements that would end up being true regardless of the parallel postulate is... I was proud of that animation there. Like that. So this is Euclid's wording, to construct, which maybe doesn't make a lot of sense. What's intended by that is it is possible to construct an equilateral triangle on a given finite straight line. You might remember this from, let's see, I'm trying to think how to best show this. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so people at home should be able to see this behind me.
Hi there.
All right, thanks for joining. Grab that eraser over there. Okay, so I'm trying to draw this so people at home can see as well.
No.
I don't even know what this means. What does it mean? It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so this statement right here, to construct an equilateral triangle on a given finite straight line. So what this is saying is, if I have a straight line, it's possible for me to use a compass and straight edge construction to create an equilateral triangle. Anybody remember how to do that?
Oh, do you like
60 degrees.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you're not allowed to just like measure an angle degree. You can only use circles and lines.
Oh, from the
Make lines at 60 degrees.
No, you don't really know what
So you
70 degrees
make a
is.
point, you make a length, and then you just
And then you go from
Put
that
the circle
one.
on the
Yeah, where it
in the
intersects,
middle
and
of the
then-
line, and then you
and then,
go out.
wow. Where
you
they intersect.
go out from a point and up, that's
I
down.
can sort of
I thought I
see
had a
my
giant
head.
compass somewhere, but oh well. So, I think, I'm trying to remember because it's been a long time since I've done this. If you choose a point on the line and you choose some point out here in space, if you create a circle
Yeah,
that goes out to there,
yeah.
and then you put your compass right here, keeping that same distance, you can extend your compass out to this dot and you can make your circle go this way. And then if you, oh, that should have, if it was a real circle, it would have gone through here. And then if you connect these, let me use a different color. This is not looking good because it's not a real construction. If you connect these, that would be an equilateral triangle. Now, so that's the very first theorem in Euclid's Elements, is that you can create an equilateral triangle using this compass straight edge construction. Yeah.
Wait, okay, so how are they able to use like circles if there's no postulate for circles?
Is it just a curved line?
The very first, or the second one?
Second one.
The second one dealt with circles.
Line moves that.
Third one. You can describe a circle with any center and distance. So here I made circles with center and distance.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Really?
Okay, let's see. This is where we are, right? Okay, so another theorem that shows up as part of this neutral geometry, not depending on parallel postulate. Isosceles triangles, angles at the base equal one another. Okay, so there are more definitions than I gave here. I haven't given you everything that's in this, but it's understood that an isosceles triangle is one which has two sides of the same length. Given our understanding that that is what an isosceles triangle is, then it can be proved that those base angles are the same. And they take it even one step further here, then they say if we actually extend those angles, then those outer angles are the same as well. So basically just stuff about triangles. You guys, it's kind of just obvious. Like this is why a lot of students struggle in geometry, is because you have to make those proofs early on, and a lot of them are like, well, it's just true, right? And a lot of this stuff early on just makes sense. Like it's an isosceles triangle. Of course, those two angles are the same, and then it progresses from there. Or was I talking about this one? This is what I was talking about. What's this one? Are they the same?
Yeah.
Did I just repeat that?
Yeah,
I did.
So you were talking about that one.
I was. I'm not sure what I did there. I think I had another really cool one to show you. Oh well.
Here's the lines were you?
Okay, but once we get beyond that neutral geometry, we need to incorporate the parallel postulate in order to come up with more theorems. So after using the parallel postulate, we could state that it's possible to construct a square on a straight line. So given a straight line, we can create a square, and it kind of makes sense that that requires the parallel postulate because squares are going to have parallel sides. So it turns out in order to make that construction, the parallel postulate has to be true. And so some other theorems dealing with parallel lines. You'll recognize the third one. So in order to come up with the Pythagorean theorem, it turns out to require the parallel postulate. The Pythagorean theorem can actually be used in replacement of the parallel postulate. So it's logically equivalent. It's allowed to just swap those back and forth. So all of these now require the parallel postulate. So what we're getting into now is like, okay, the parallel postulate's super wordy, not totally intuitive when you read it. So what if it's not true? And if it's not true, then all of these things that we understand to be true become not true statements. And we basically now get the opposite. So in order to come up with non-Euclidean geometry, we negate the parallel postulate. We take the opposite of it, which turns out can be done in two different ways. a minute. Let's get that. Okay. So here is. I don't like. What am I doing here? I'm going to switch the order of some things here. Give me a sec. I was doing some tweaking. I don't like how that ended up.
Oh.
Okay, I want to start here. Okay, so we're going to use this statement for the parallel postulate. So here's another one that's logically equivalent.
Share the screen.
Oh, thank you. Stupid Zoom. Yeah. Oh, it's Phidippides, who is the Greek soldier that ran the original marathon from Marathon to Athens. So that's his name.
I thought Marathon's name was Marathon.
No, Marathon's the place.
Oh.
Well, what a coincidence that the place that he ran from ended up being
it's
called
crazy how
Marathon, even with all that
crazy
distance.
that, what a coincidence, language, man.
That's crazy.
Dude.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Here we go. Okay. So here's another statement that's equivalent. Let's take a moment to just process this. You have a line, G, and a point P not on G. So let me sketch out what that would look like. So we have a line, and we're calling this line G. We have a point P that's not on G. There exists a unique line through P parallel to G, meaning there is just one line that goes through that point and is parallel. Right? So that's another way to describe the parallel postulate. Well, we want to take the opposite of this. And since it says there is a unique line through point P, what would be the opposite of saying there is a unique line? Yeah.
There is no unique line?
There is no unique line. What's another way of saying the opposite of that? There are many lines. Yeah, so we can negate it in two ways. So we could take this. There we go. First, what we'd end up with calling spherical geometry, we negate this by saying there are no lines through that point that are parallel. Basically, in this geometry, we're saying there are no parallel lines. They don't exist. So what we're doing right now is we're taking the opposite of this statement. This statement says you have a line and a point not on the line. There's one line that goes through that point and is parallel. And we're just taking the opposite of it. And one way to take the opposite of that is to say there are no lines. And another way of saying that is there are many lines that go through that point. Just for kicks and giggles. So the idea here was, okay, we're not so sure if we like that statement. What happens if that statement is not true? Like, what's the end result if we do assume that axiom is not true? And we get these things which we call spherical and hyperbolic geometry.
Wait, Joyce.
Yeah.
So if they proved, right, that you could not, like, that you could not prove, I guess, disprove the parallel postulate, then how are they able to make the assumption that it's false?
Well, so it's not so much that we're making the assumption that it's false. We're creating an entirely new geometry.
Okay.
So we're saying there exists this geometry, which we'll call Euclidean, or planar geometry. And we're saying for that, the parallel postulate is true. What I was saying, though, is the parallel postulate cannot be proved from the other four. So from those other four postulates, those cannot be assembled in some way to show us that the parallel postulate is true. So it could be true or it could be not true.
It's just an assumption that we then base.
Because we're just making that assumption. And so we've made one assumption, we're saying, well, now let's make a different assumption. Let's see what happens.
Okay.
And so if we make that assumption that for this particular statement here, that there are no parallel lines through a point, or here that there are many parallel lines through a point, we get these new geometries. What's going to happen here is we have that neutral geometry, which is all the stuff prior to using the parallel postulate. That's all going to be the same. But then we get to stuff that incorporates the parallel postulate, and now our results end up being different. Right? So we end up saying, well, if this statement here for spherical geometry is true, then these things end up happening. And so let's see what those things are. Yeah?
Can you do this for other postulates? So it's just
You could. Yeah, you definitely could. I don't think those have been examined in nearly as much detail because they have always been sort of just accepted as being like, all right. But you could say, what if there is no way to draw a circle around a point? And you're going to get something totally different. I have no idea what that's going to end up looking like. That would be a very big exercise to undertake. But You could definitely do that. What's that?
You could be the next Euclid.
I could. I'll write another book.
Joyce's geometry.
So here is where, now, spherical geometry should make complete sense to us. As the name implies, it's geometry on a sphere. Most of us believe we live on a sphere. If we can't agree with that, I don't know. If you have a sphere, and you create, actually, yeah, here. So if you just focus in on where we are right here, and I wanted to create a triangle, I just make my triangle, angles out up to 180 degrees, no big deal, because we're on a small scale. It's essentially flat. But once we go bigger, then we end up getting things that are very, very different. So look at this right here. This is a triangle. This is a triangle in spherical geometry. The way we make lines in spherical geometry is you have a sphere, and your circles are what we call great circles, meaning they're circles that take like the longest route around. So we've got what? Latitude and longitude. Lines of latitude. Longitude.
Latitude or ladders?
Lines of latitude are considered lines in spherical geometry. Longitude are not, with the exception of the equator. So like it's a little circle that goes around here is not considered to be a line in spherical geometry. It has to go through the center.
So it must have essentially length because of like the circumference of a cross section.
Yeah. The way it's defined is the circle is the cross section of the sphere and a circle who both share the same center. Right? Yeah. I think I've got this in place here. So, spherical geometry, a plane is the surface of a sphere. A line in spherical geometry is, well, like I was saying, a great circle. How do I have it defined here? A circle whose center would be the center of the sphere. Yeah.
So it's always the greatest circumference.
So it's always going around the largest circle possible on the given sphere. So you couldn't have a little circle that just like goes like this. Like think like the Arctic Circle. That would not count as a line. It doesn't meet the definition.
Sure. But what if it did?
Oh man, something else entirely. Okay, so this is what we call a triangle here. And what's really interesting with triangles in spherical geometry, and since I don't know whose ball this is, I'm going to draw on it. I don't know if this is going to... Here we go. Okay. So if I draw a circle, let's imagine this is the equator. I don't know if using a black line on this ball with black lines is a good idea. Oh. Okay, so I've got this thing here going around. Now if I draw another line, I'm going to start it here, and I'm going to go around completely perpendicular, 90 degrees. Okay, and I'm going to go all the way around. Or I've got to make sure I don't lose my spot here. Okay, so these have met at 90 degrees. I've got two lines meeting at 90 degrees. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to draw another line meeting at 90 degrees. Okay, I'm going to go all the way around. And as I've done that, what I've now come up with is a triangle. So this right here, I'm going to make the lines kind of squeegily.
Whoa. No.
This is a triangle on a sphere, and the sum of the angles is 270 degrees.
Bro, no. Why?
Pass it around. Or maybe don't because of COVID. Pass it around with sanitary wipes.
Doesn't that take the Sharpie off though?
Yeah.
No, it's just sanitize your hands.
Just sanitize your hands beforehand. Everyone go grab hand sanitizer.
Wait, so when people say that we can prove that a triangle doesn't always have 180 degrees, that's what they're talking about.
That you have to use a different geometry.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why was that a good idea, Marina?
They add up to more than 180, less than or equal to 270.
Wait, I really like triangles. Well, I guess.
Thank you. I love your
Okay, yeah,
jacket.
exactly. Okay.
I feel like we're just trying to we're like
Yeah, we're kind of
animated.
the same look.
Yeah.
Okay, some other consequences in spherical geometry. There are no parallel lines. That's what we get from negating the parallel postulate. And that makes sense. If everything's a greater circle, they have to cross somewhere. So there are no lines that do not cross. The sum of the angles of a triangle are always bigger than 180, and it turns out, as we just saw there, they're less than or equal to 270. So they're bounded in between. Yep. So we've got those three angles, always bigger than 180. And as far as similar triangles go, if triangles are similar, meaning they have the same angles, they've got to be congruent. There's no way, think of similar triangles as you learn them. You can have a small triangle, you can have a bigger triangle. They're the same shape, right? Same angles, but different side lengths. That can't happen in spherical geometry.
So, does that depend on how? Does that depend on how? Actually, I don't know how to word this. What changes the angles of the triangle? What makes it say be closer to 180 than 270?
How far apart they are. If you brought these in closer together, the angle measures in gets smaller. If they're the same size. So similar triangles, as you learn them, you have a small triangle and a bigger triangle. They look the same. That can't happen here. If they're going to have the same angles, they're going to be the same size. Okay, now we get in. So spherical geometry makes the most sense of the alternate forms of geometry. Hyperbolic geometry, not so much, but it's still kind of cool.
It's like now.
Lost ball.
Joyce.
Wow. So in hyperbolic geometry, it's kind of the one way to think of hyperbolic geometry is if you have a hyperbolic paraboloid. Remember hyperbolic paraboloids? We learned about hyperbolic paraboloids. Basically, it's a hyperbola. We know what hyperbola looks like, right? It's kind of like a parabola, but a little bit straighter on the sides. It's a three-dimensional hyperbola where the cross sections are parabolas. So it's kind of bowl-shaped. Here's the top. It's a bad color, but this is the top half of one. So it keeps on going out, approaching those asymptotes in the diagonals. If you have that as your surface, and you intersected that surface with what we think of as a traditional plane, a two-dimensional straight plane, the intersection there, that right there is what we call a line in hyperbolic geometry. A better way of visualizing that is to then imagine you're looking straight down, and you get this disc right here, and you get this intersection on the disc.
What?
So the way it's often visualized is as a disc, and it turns out it's a disc that has no edge. Like you can never quite get to the edge. You always get closer and closer and closer. And so this is our visualization. These things we call lines on this disc turn out to be sections of circles that meet the edge at 90 degrees.
There is no edge.
Okay.
Well, that approach the edge at 90 degrees.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Why isn't the projection of the hyperbola down onto the dish just a straight line? Why isn't it a straight line?
Because it's slightly going out that way.
Why?
You know what?
Because you intersect it with a line, right? Or you intersect with a plane. If that plane was straight up and down, 90 degrees like this, you would have a straight line.
Okay, but it's just,
We're just saying this random one.
So looking at it as the hyperbolic paraboloid is not the most common way to visualize this. That disc down there, which is called Poincare's disc, that's the more common way of visualizing it. I've got a better view. Here are a bunch of lines on Poincare's disc. So these lines, like I said, are portions of circles that meet the edge approaching an angle of 90 degrees. That creates all these things. I'll go back. Yeah.
Could you just try what a circle is here again?
A circle in this case is what we think of as a plane circle. So just like a normal circle that we, in order for us to visualize it, we sort of have to create this hybrid between planar geometry and these other geometries. So what we have to accept here is like, okay, we can view this in a plane, but we can't think of our lines as being what we consider to be straight. Our lines now, based off this projection, end up being sections of circles. Yeah.
You're saying all lines are made from the point of a circle that touches a 90.
Yeah, so you choose a point somewhere in here. You chose a point. You can then sketch the circle that would meet at 90 degrees. So like, look at this. If I tried to sketch something that was not the right side, if I chose a point here, and I said, I'm going to make a little circle. Well, this doesn't count because it doesn't meet at 90 degrees. If I tried to make a different circle, if I said, okay, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, maybe it's like this, and it stops right there, and this one goes, and it stops right there. This doesn't count because those aren't meeting at 90 degrees. So there's only one line through that point that's going to meet at 90 degrees. So let me choose a point that's on one of these.
So how does this fit into...
So if I chose this point here, this is the only arc of a circle that is going to intersect at 90 degrees. If I went bigger, it's going to intersect at something less than 90 degrees, or if I went smaller, it comes around and loops around and also does not intersect at 90 degrees. So there's only one line through each point. And by line, again, I mean section of a circle. By the way, any confusion you have here on this is totally understandable because the first person to ever consider hyperbolic geometry just wrote it off saying, these things aren't lines, this is stupid, this doesn't exist. That was basically their conclusion.
How does this
So
tie in?
you just have to rethink how you think of a line.
You're saying within this circle that we're looking at, you can only get the parts of circles that'll meet the edge of that circle at 90. Who are all of these little guys though?
There's a whole bunch of circles. So as you get, if your point gets closer to the edge, then the circles get smaller.
Okay, so how does this fit into the fact that with this type of geometry, we assume that there would be like an infinite amount of lines, or there were many lines through one point that could be parallel?
Here we go.
Okay.
So let's see what happens with hyperbolic geometry. We can at least kind of just say, okay, Mr. Joyce, we'll go along with what you're saying here. If you take this line right here, and you choose some point, and I think I was misspeaking, I was saying there's only one point that's that the curve goes through, which was not accurate. I was trying to get to the point of, like, if I'm extending a certain direction, then that curve has to be of a certain diameter. But the point is here, all of these little circular arcs come out and meet at 90 degrees, this one and this one and this one. They all go through the same point. And our definition of parallel is that a line goes through a different point and does not intersect the given line. None of these intersect that line. So we have actually infinitely many lines through that point that are parallel to the line out. Right?
Wait, but they're not parallel.
But they are.
No.
Do they meet each other?
No.
They're not parallel. Thank you.
Wait, okay, how do they not lines?
Thanks for agreeing with me.
They're not lines.
They're not lines.
Refute the existence of
And then what we would end up getting from this after we go analyzing things, if we have a triangle, then the sum of the angles is going to be less than 180 degrees. So just the very opposite of spherical geometry. So there's a hyperbolic triangle.
What?
And also, this one actually turns out to be the same as in spherical geometry with similar triangles. Once again, if they're similar, they must be congruent. They must be the same size.
Okay, so we were just saying it's circular geometry though, they're between 180 to 270. This guy,
They're always less than.
What about this triangle?
The edge doesn't count. This edge, because you get closer and closer to the edge, but that edge does not exist. That edge is not a line.
Oh, that's why I said we should go forever. I remember.
Okay, so there's very clear applications to planar geometry, Euclidean geometry. Very clear applications to spherical geometry. Hyperbolic geometry, not so much. But as far as what happens on a large scale, like in the universe, what that actually is, that's still kind of TBD. So maybe there are applications of hyperbolic. What?
What's that?
So there very well could be applications to hyperbolic on a much, much larger scale. Maybe not. Maybe it's just nice and very spherical or whatever, but...
The assumption is that if the universe is infinite, then it would be hyperbolic because the edge, there is no edge.
Yeah. So there are definitely potential applications on that scale. Anyway, that's my intro to non-Euclidean geometry. I think it's kind of cool.
Yeah, if you project a sphere onto that, it's a
Alright, look at this again. Come on, send it
Alright, thank you all. As far as the rest of the year, let's see what we got here. Today is Wednesday?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Today is Wednesday, so we've got Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday. When do you start doing your graduation stuff?
Thursday.
Tomorrow? Okay, so we're done. Next Thursday. So you're here on Wednesday.
Yes.
Thursday you start doing graduation stuff. In the morning. Oh. So, yeah, because it's usually a half day. I don't. Okay.
Thursday and Friday.
I'm trying to decide how to handle the last few days. I think what I might do is maybe 2 or 3 mini lessons on. I could do this 2 ways. We could go back and review what we actually learned this year because I feel like we have forgotten.
No, I know.
Like just as like not with any homework associated with it, just like reminder like, hey, we did this. Or I could go on and I could teach you more stuff that normally I would have taught, but I didn't this year.
What Nick just said.
What?
Ultimate?
It's pretty hot.
We bring water bottles next time.
Yeah. I will consider.
Outside.
I'll take other
I mean, we're already doing that
suggestions.
inside right now.
Yeah.
I kind of like the mind-bending, like cool math stuff like this.
Yeah, this is just hard for me to put together.
How do you organize?
But I would like to, because I'd like to do some like number theory and stuff like that. But a lot of those require so much groundwork to get into that it's hard to do just like a mini lesson on it. That's the biggest challenge.
How do you get it to be like? No. Like you're just like, and that's it.
I expected to do 30 minutes. Okay, well, I will consider. In the end, I get to make the decisions, right? So, we'll see.
See if I can hit.
Wait, swat it.
But throw a frisbee left-handed.
See, he's just like.
You want to know what's really bad for me with ultimate though? I throw this way left-handed, and for my side I throw right-handed, so it's useless. Because I can't get around it.
Yeah. All the way into the wall. Send it up. Send it up. The ball went back.
Sense, Mike.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, I did it again.
Thank you.
Watch out. Right where I was standing. Excuse me?
Right back, too.
Yeah? Have you ever noticed that, like, how everyone in computer science is like an absolute genius? Genius. Genius at what? There's a lot there. I'll say there's a lot of smart people. We have a lot of actually smart people. Not everyone is. Not everyone, but there's a lot of people that are like the same.